Welcome back to another episode of Pilgrim's Progress. Last week, Christian and Faithful got rid of Talkative and he was no good, and Evangelist warned them about the town that they were now coming to, the town of Vanity. Because right in the middle of that town there was this fair, Vanity Fair. And this fair, like this circus almost, carried going all year round. It wasn't just for a little while, it was forever. Everything that was sold there was vanity, it was meaningless, it was pointless, it was just showing off everything that people had. But this wasn't a new thing. This fair was ancient. It had stood there for thousands of years. 5,000 years ago, two pilgrims passed by on their way to the celestial city, and Beelzebub, Apollyon, and Legion all decided it would be amazing to set up something to get in their way, to stop them on their journey, to slow them down. So they set up this fair, and all around it there's these houses, lands, different trades, honours, titles, countries, kingdoms, lusts, pleasures, delights, masters, servants, silver and gold. All sorts of amazing things there, tempting things, they said, to distract these pilgrims. And it's you see all the time there people cheating and just messing around, fools. There's stealing, there's murders, killing, adulteries, liars. And there's rows and rows of houses and streets. There's England Street, Wales Street, Scotland Street. In fact, there's a street for every country in the world. French streets, German streets, American streets. Every country in the world is represented. You have to go through Vanity Fair on the way to Celestial City. There's no way round it. And even the Prince of Princes, when he was here, had to travel through. And Beelzebub, the chief lord of the fair, decided to invite him to buy some of the stuff that was on sale, some of the vanities, the pointless things. And he took him round stall by stall and road by road and showed him everything and said, I could make you lord of this fair. I can make you lord of everything you see. But the prince, he wasn't tempted. He didn't spend any money there. And he left, he walked on through without being harmed. Well, Christian and Faithful arrived in the fair. Everyone crowded around them, all sorts of different people. But instead of welcoming them, they just stared at them. And then they started to pick on them. They said, "Look at your clothes. They're so weird. Different from anything we sell here. Where did you get those from, stupid?" And people started muttering about them behind their backs. Then when they listened to them talk, they said, "You talk so weird. You talk really different to us. What are those words you use? And can't understand you properly." Because they spoke the language of Canaan. And then every time they walked past a stall with vanities being sold, and people shouting for them to buy stuff, they kept putting their fingers in their ears because they didn't care about buying anything. And it started to annoy people. So someone said, "What will you buy then?" And Christian and Faithful answered, "We'll buy the truth. That's what we'll pay for. That's worth money." And with that, everyone got angry and upset. They started to shout at them. They started to mock them. They stirred everyone up. Crowds came shouting. So it wasn't long before it made the attention of the soldiers. And they came to arrest Christian and Faithful, to ask them what they were doing there. So they interrogated them at the police station. "What is all this?" The man at the police station said, What are these weird clothes? Why are you talking that way? Why have you got your fingers in your ears? Why do you seem to hate us? Why all this?" And Christian and Faithful calmly said, We're pilgrims and strangers in this world on our way to the heavenly Jerusalem, the celestial city. We haven't given any reason for you to hate us. We haven't given any reason for you to despise us. But the guy in charge, he didn't care. He just thought they were mad. So he had them beaten up and whipped and punched and kicked in front of everybody, and then they just smeared all this mud and dirt over them, made them so dirty and stinking, and then they locked them in a cage and put them as like a little stall at the fair for people to come and laugh at, to be cruel to hate on, to take out all their revenge on. And poor Christian and Faithful stayed there, taking everybody's jokes, and people took out their revenge on them, kicked the cage as they walked by, and they just hated it. And the great one of the fair just stood there laughing at them all the time. But amazingly, Christian and Faithful were patient. They didn't shout back. When someone shouted and swore at them, they just said good words back. When someone cursed them and insulted them, they blessed them. When someone was mean and horrible, they were kind. And this started to have an effect on people at the fair. They started to notice. And some of them who didn't hate them so much started to say to the others, hey, these guys, they don't deserve this. In fact, this has happened before. Other people like them have come through our town, and they've been put in the cage, and they didn't deserve it. Look at how they're answering. They're not shouting back. They're peaceful. And they started to say, this is wrong. But the rest of the crowd said, no, you're wrong, you're wrong. And they just started shouting. And in the end, it got so violent, they all started beating each other up and fighting amongst themselves. Christian and Faithful just calmly watched on. What was all this madness that was going on? But the soldiers came again, saw this fighting. And so they brought Christian and Faithful out and blamed it on them, that this is your fault. This is your fault. You've caused all this fighting. There's no problem. Everyone used to get along. Everyone used to be happy and fine before you came. It's your fault, all this commotion, all this division. So they led them up and down the fair for people to mock, people to beat up even more. And they put them back in their cage, tied them up with chains. They got all the blame for this trouble. But Christian and Faithful behaved wisely. They didn't react. People were saying they should die, and they started to remember Evangelist's words, that if one of them did die, they would be actually better off. And the treatment they had, they started to believe it and see it. It became real because they'd had so many hard things. This was harder than the valley of humiliation, harder than the valley of the shadow of death. Evangelist was right. And so they started to encourage each other with Evangelist's words. Remember, if you're faithful to the point of death, the prince will give you the crown. We'll be better off. And they prayed and they committed themselves to the king. In the morning, the crowd wouldn't leave them alone, and they dragged them into court for a trial to see if they were guilty or innocent. And the judge who was going to be in charge of the trial was Lord Hategood. And he read out the charge against them. You've been accused of being enemies of vanity, disturbers of our town. You've divided everyone in the town where it was peaceful and happy before. And you've won over a crowd who support you. We're going to call up these witnesses against you to say what they've seen and heard. The first man up was Envy. And he said, this man Faithful and this man Christian, they don't care about anyone here. I heard him say that our ways of life are two totally different things. And he goes around trying to convince everyone to follow him. He doesn't just condemn what we do, he condemns us. It's terrible. And he sat down. The second witness was called up to the stand. Superstition. And he said, well, I don't know him, but I don't really want to get to know him either. He said our religion is worth nothing and can't please God. He said our worship is pointless and empty. And there's no way we could be right with God believing what we believe. That is terrible. And he sat down all angry. They called the third witness, Mr. Gain Glory. I have heard of him, but I don't really want to hear the things he was saying. He picked on all our lords in our town, Lord Luxurious, Lord Carnal Delight, so greedy, and others. And he says if it was up to him, they wouldn't be lords here at all. There wouldn't be a place for them in our town at all. And he calls you, Lord Hategood, the judge, an ungodly villain. The judge, Lord Hategood, looked at Faithful and Christian and said, You deserve to die for all this. What have you got to say for yourselves? The Faithful stood up. And he said about envy, he said, but I can't say anything different. Your laws are against God's laws. I'm just speaking the truth. Just speaking the truth. Your ways are totally different to God's ways. And superstition, you need a real faith. It must be done by the book. You need to know the God you believe in. And Mr. Gain Glory, all the lords in this town, they are more suited to being in hell if they carry on. The Lord have mercy on me. Faithful couldn't change his mind. Well, the judge handed it over to the jury. Mr. No Good, Mr. Malice, Mr. Love Lust, Mr. Live Loose, Mr. Heady, Mr. High Mind, Mr. Enmity, Mr. Liar, Mr. Cruelty, and Mr. Hate Light, and Mr. No Satisfying. And it didn't take them long. Didn't take them long at all. They all came back with their own reasons why they hated Faithful for saying what he'd said. They hated Christian for stirring up and causing all sorts of trouble in their town. And they said about Faithful, unanimously, every single one of them, kill him, he's guilty, kill him. So they grabbed him. The judge said, you're guilty, you're going to have to die. So they grabbed Faithful. They grabbed him. And he said, you're guilty. He slammed his hammer down. And they took him outside. And they started whipping him. Then they beat him up. Then they cut him with knives. Then they threw stones at him and his body was bruised. Then they stabbed him with swords. And then they took him out to this big wooden stake. And they set fire to him. And they burned him until he was just ashes on the floor. So Faithful met his end. He stood there bravely with the crowd mocking, shouting, so pleased that they got rid of this guy. He just burned until he was ashes. Christian stood there in tears. But John Bunyan says, as I looked, behind the crowd that was still so pleased with themselves for their evil, burning this man alive and getting rid of him, I saw a white chariot with horses And once they'd finished making an end to Faithful, I saw Faithful walk through the crowd, completely untouched by any of them. He stepped into the chariot, and it carried him up the fastest possible way to the celestial city. Faithful was not dead. He was alive, and he disappeared in glory into the celestial city. Christian got sent back to prison for a little while, and he had a chance to think, and he was just praying and praying, and he was so sad. But he remembered Evangelist's words, and he just got forgotten. But then the one who overrules everything and who controls all the raging of all the crowds decided it was time, and he set Christian free. And Christian went on his way singing so loudly because he had time to think about Faithful's death. Well, Faithful, you have faithfully professed unto your Lord, with whom you shall be blessed. When faithless ones with all their vain delights are crying out under their hellish plights, sing, Faithful, sing, and let your name survive. For though they killed you, you are yet alive. If you want to find out what happens next, you're going to have to tune in next week. So we're going to look back over today's story and see what Jesus wants us to learn from it. And this Vanity Fair is not anything new. It's the way that the world has chosen to live without God, without Jesus. And that makes nearly everything in life pointless and meaningless. And if you read Ecclesiastes in the Bible, that's what Solomon is teaching. Jesus is teaching through Solomon there that everything under the sun, in other words, everything without looking to heaven, without looking to Jesus, everything's meaningless, pointless. It doesn't matter how much money you've got. You can work hard and then you die and you leave it to someone. You don't know how your business is going to go. You don't know how all the things you've worked hard to do are going to go. They could all fail and fall apart. And it's all meaningless and pointless without Jesus. And there's all sorts of things shouting out, calling out to you in the world to come and taste and eat and enjoy and buy. And remember, Jesus was tempted first by the devil, and the devil led him up to a high place where he could see all the different countries in the world, and the devil said, they're mine to give. If you bow down and worship me, I will make you Lord of them all. I'll give you them all. But Jesus said, it's written, worship God and him only. And Jesus safely passed through that temptation. But so often we get tempted that there is meaning without God in all these things, in money and relationships and all these different things that tempt us. Say, buy this, eat this, drink this. And it's in every country across the world. You can find it anywhere. Absolutely everywhere. There's all these different temptations, and you can't follow Jesus without meeting all of them along the way, and they're all very dangerous. And the world does generally hate Christians, Christian and Faithful. You know, they got accused of wearing these weird clothes. They talk different. They weren't interested in the world, and they got mocked for it. And it's the same today. If you want to follow Jesus, people won't understand like how you come across what you're saying. It's almost like you talk a different language about being saved, being forgiven. They're like, what's that? No one's guilty. Everyone's got a good heart. Whereas Jesus says we're all sinful in our hearts and we all need saving. But it's a language that the world doesn't understand almost. It seems so strange. And when we live lives that are not interested in what they're interested in, when we say, no, I'm not going to join in, they can't understand. They do pick on us, they persecute us, they say all sorts of things, they accuse us, and they're like, well, what are you living for? And when you say the truth of Jesus, they just mock. And so many Christians across history have suffered for Jesus. So Faithful and Christian are like just showing us that if you suffer for following Jesus, it's not something strange. It's not something he can't help you with. It's not something he is powerless against and unable to comfort you in. It's just the world hated Jesus before us. The world loves darkness rather than light, Jesus says, and it will happen to you at some point. And the way to deal with it is just to give an honest answer with the truth that Jesus speaks in the Bible, no matter what happens to you. Christian and Faithful were beaten up, they were taken the mick out of, weren't they? They got spat on and hated and accused of all sorts of stuff. And what did they do? Just like Jesus, they didn't open their mouth. They didn't curse people for hating them. They didn't fight back. They didn't try and get revenge. They left it all into Jesus' hands. And that's what we have to do. Remember, Jesus took the blame when he was innocent for all our sin. Jesus took a huge beating on the cross for all our sin. He took our guilt and our shame, and he did it so gladly, so happily, because he loves us. And he says our attitude is to be the same. When the world starts fighting with each other, they always blame it on Christians. And that's what happened to poor Christian and Faithful here, isn't it? They had a bit of a debate about whether being a Christian was right or wrong. Some of them started to change, but they had a massive fight. But see, if you behave like Jesus, people will start to notice. And there was a small group here who started to realise how they treated Christians were wrong, how they treated Jesus was wrong. They started questioning. Can you imagine if Christian and Faithful had just fought back and been like the world? That little group wouldn't have noticed. So what an encouragement for us to leave all our words and our actions in Jesus' hands, to behave like him. He will work, he will convict, he will convince people by our behaviour, by looking like Jesus, that following Jesus is the right thing to do. It might only be a small group, but it is some. And we can comfort ourselves with that we're being like Jesus. That's what they did with evangelist words, and they prayed, and we need to pray for Jesus' help, because it's so tempting just to get people back. It's so tempting to rage like they do. It's so tempting to be angry like they are. But we need to be calm. We need to realise whatever we suffer, like Paul said, I'm a prisoner for Jesus. It's Jesus who's allowed me to be here. It's Jesus who wants me to be here. Someone might even turn to Jesus through all the suffering that I'm going through. And in court, well, we might not be in court. Some Christians have been, but we get all these accusations, don't we? We hear them all. Envy, who wants to be first, and people say all sorts of things. They said it all against Jesus, isn't it? He's claiming to be God. The whole world is going after him. We can't have that. And we'll come up against all these attitudes that accuse us, and the devil's behind them all. So we need to stay, like Faithful, we need to stay faithful to Jesus and what he says, no matter what the cost, no matter what people say, even if they say we deserve to die. That's what the devil comes to do. He comes to steal, kill and destroy. And we need to cling to Jesus for help. And so many Christians, like Faithful, have been killed for following Jesus. Now, you might not be physically killed, but it could still happen mentally, and that, isn't it? Jesus says to hate your brother is the same as murdering him in your heart. To hate someone in your heart is the same as killing. And we know people do that, don't they? They write us off like we're dead. They might say, you're dead to me. You were a friend, now you're dead to me. I'm not talking to you. I hate you. I'm going to make your life a misery. But it shows Jesus has enough comfort and help to help you no matter how bad it gets. He helped Faithful. The Father helped Jesus when he was dying on the cross. Jesus helped Stephen when he was being stoned for following Jesus. And there it is. Even if we have to lose our lives for following Jesus, it's not the end. We're not really dead. What a lovely picture reminding us of Elijah. He was taken up to heaven with those flaming chariots, wasn't he, and horses in glory. And that's what waits for us. Down here it will be hard, there'll be persecution, there'll be misunderstandings, people accusing us of all sorts, be put on trial, be brought before all the authorities, they won't understand. We may even lose our lives, but in the end, what's waiting for us? Remember, Evangelist said, a crown of life. And Jesus is waiting to give us that crown of life, to say, well done, good and faithful servant. So whether some of us are taken, some of us are left here to live a little bit longer. Remember that lovely song, Christian was full of the truth that faithful was now home with Jesus. And all those lovely Christians in our church family who have gone now, they're not gone forever. They are alive, living with Jesus. And what a hope we have. He will not let anything snatch us out of his hands. It is worth trusting in Jesus, even if it means dying for him. We can live for him with all his help. So here's some Bible study. So how was Jesus tempted? How can we be tempted by the world? Then what will happen to every Christian, but who can encourage us? How did Jesus deal with suffering, and how should we? What does Jesus promise us if we endure to the end, if we follow him right to the end, no matter what? And then you can add Vanity Fair with everyone in and all the goods to your map. And then in the Bible, think and pray through who suffered for following Jesus and how did Jesus help them and how is he still helping them now. See you next time.